When I first moved into the building on Crescent Avenue, I wasn't looking for much. A cheap apartment, a quiet space, and a place to start over after my divorce. Apartment 313 was everything I needed, small but clean. And the landlord, an older man named Mr. Henley, offered me a rent I couldn't refuse. He said the last tenant had left suddenly, and they just wanted someone reliable. I didn't ask why. I should have. The first few days were normal. I unpacked, set up my small living room, and started working from home. The apartment had a strange echo though, even when I spoke quietly. It sounded like someone was repeating my words from far away. I figured it was just the old walls. The first odd thing happened on the 5th night. I woke up around 3 in the morning because my bedroom door creaked open. I thought it was the draft from the window, but when I sat up, I saw that the window was closed tight. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and walked to the living room. Everything was still, except for the TV. It was on. Static filled the screen, and a low humming sound came from the speakers. I didn't remember turning it on. I reached for the remote, but before I could grab it, the TV flickered. For a second, I saw what looked like a man's face reflected in the static, pale. Eyes wide, mouth open like he was trying to scream. Then it was gone. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just tired. I had been under a lot of stress. But then the footsteps started. Soft ones, moving through the hallway at night when I was in bed. They always stopped right outside my bedroom door. A week later, I met my neighbor, a quiet woman in her 60s named Mrs. Callahan. She lived across the hall and seemed kind, though she looked tired all the time. When I mentioned I had moved into 313, her expression changed. "That place should have stayed empty," she said quietly. I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head. "Keep your lights on at night," she whispered before closing her door. That night, I left a small lamp on beside my bed. Around 2:47 a.m., I woke to the faint sound of whispering. Not loud, just a soft murmur from the corner of the room. My lamp flickered once, and the whispering stopped. When I looked toward the corner, I saw it, the outline of a man standing perfectly still. He was tall, his face hidden in the dark, but I could see the shape of his shoulders, the curve of his head. I blinked, and he was gone. The next morning, I noticed something on the mirror near the door. Words written faintly in the dust, like a finger had drawn them. "Don't stay." The morning light spilled gently across the living room, but to Ethan, it felt colder than ever. He stood motionless, staring at the faint shadow on the wall. It had not been there before. He blinked once, twice, thinking it was a trick of the sunlight, but it did not fade. It moved slightly, as if breathing. His heart began to pound, heavy and uneven. He stepped back slowly, his bare feet brushing against the wooden floor. The apartment was silent except for the ticking clock on the shelf. Then, a faint creak came from the hallway, the sound of a footstep. Ethan froze. His phone was on the table, just a few steps away, but his legs refused to move. He whispered to himself, "It's just the wind." But the air was still. Gathering courage, he reached for the bedroom door and pushed it open. Sunlight from the window filled the room. Everything looked normal, the bed neatly made, the curtains swaying slightly, the mirror reflecting the calm of the morning. But when he turned toward the mirror again, his reflection wasn't looking back at him. His reflection stood perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, even though Ethan had turned his head. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then the reflection's mouth began to move slowly, forming silent words. Ethan's heart raced as he leaned closer, trying to read the lips. The reflection whispered a single word that fogged the mirror from the inside. It was his name, Ethan. The glass cracked suddenly, splitting the reflection into two distorted faces. Ethan stumbled back, gasping for breath. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the room itself was closing in on him. He ran out, slamming the bedroom door behind him. For a long moment, he stood in the hallway, trembling. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The faint shadow on the living room wall was gone, but a dark outline now stretched across the floor, longer, closer, leading directly toward where he stood. Ethan grabbed his keys with shaking hands and stumbled toward the door. The air inside the apartment felt wrong now, too quiet, too heavy. He twisted the lock and flung the door open. desperate for the comfort of sunlight and city noise. But when he stepped outside, everything was still. The street below was empty. Cars were parked, but not a single person moved. The sound of the world, birds, engines, footsteps, had vanished. The morning air that should have been warm was strangely cold, biting against his skin. He leaned over the railing of the stairs, calling out, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" His voice echoed, but there was no reply. Then he noticed something chilling. Every window in the building across from him had curtains drawn tight. Yet behind one of them, a faint shape moved, slow, deliberate, like someone watching. Ethan's breath caught. He took a step back, but the door to his apartment slowly creaked shut behind him on its own. He spun around, reaching for it, but it slammed shut before his hand touched the knob. The sound echoed through the corridor, followed by silence so deep it pressed against his ears. He tried to call 911, but his phone screen stayed black no matter how many times he pressed the button. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something down the hall, a faint flicker, like someone stepping out from a doorway. It was a figure, tall, still, featureless, the same shape he had seen in the shadow inside his apartment. But now it was standing in the middle of the hallway, facing him. Ethan took one step back. The figure didn't move. He whispered, "What do you want?" No answer. Then, as if the question had awoken something, the figure tilted its head slowly to one side. The motion was unnatural, broken, like a puppet without strings. Ethan turned and ran down the stairs, 2 at a time, his footsteps echoing through the empty building. When he reached the lobby, the front door was open, sunlight pouring in. But when he stepped outside, his body froze. The city was gone. The street he had known all his life stretched out endlessly. But every sign, every building, every tree, was covered in a faint layer of ash, as if time itself had burned away. And in the distance, 100 shadows stood in silence, all facing him. Ethan stood frozen on the street of ash, his breath visible in the cold, dead air. The sky above him was bright but colorless, the kind of light that didn't belong to any hour of the day. All around him, the silent shadows waited, unmoving, yet somehow aware. He could feel their gaze pressing against his skin. He took a step forward and the ash beneath his feet shifted like soft snow, leaving clear footprints behind. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice trembling. He turned around, expecting to see the building he'd come from, but it wasn't there anymore. Behind him stretched an empty horizon. No buildings, no city, just grey, endless land. Panic rose in his chest as he started running, his shoes kicking up pale dust. The world stayed the same no matter how far he went. The sky didn't change. The shadows didn't move. But then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps following him. Slow, steady, heavy. He turned around. The shadows were gone. But one figure now stood close, too close. It was human-shaped, but its face was nothing but smooth darkness. Ethan stumbled backward, tripping on the uneven ground. His heart pounded as he screamed, "Where am I?" The figure tilted its head, and a low, distorted voice echoed around him, though its mouth never moved. "You never left," it said. "You brought this with you." Ethan shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. "No. I left the apartment. I opened the door. I came outside." The voice grew louder, surrounding him. "You left the room, not the fear." Suddenly, the ash beneath him began to ripple, like waves in water. He looked down, and saw his reflection staring back at him from the grey surface. The same reflection that had whispered his name in the mirror. It smiled. "Wake up, Ethan," it said. The ground split open. The reflection reached up with a pale hand, pulling him down into the darkness below. Ethan gasped and opened his eyes. He was back in his apartment, lying on the cold wooden floor. Morning sunlight filled the room again. Everything looked normal. The mirror in the bedroom was whole. The walls were clean. For a moment, he almost believed it had been a dream. Then he looked at the wall near the window, and saw the same dark shadow standing there, perfectly still, waiting. Ethan stared at the shadow on the wall, frozen in terror. The sunlight poured through the window, but it could not erase the darkness. It stood tall and still, shaped exactly like him, but detached from his movements. He raised his arm. Nothing happened. The The shadow didn't move. It was no longer his. His chest tightened as memories began to flash in his mind, the mirror cracking, the empty city, the voice that told him he never left. He realized now what it meant. The apartment wasn't haunted by something that found him. It was haunted by something he had become. Slowly, he stepped closer to the wall. The shadow didn't waver. Its head turned slightly toward him, as if it knew he understood. "What are you?" he whispered. The room grew colder, the light dimmed. The shadow stretched along the floor until it touched his feet. A voice rose from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You are the echo," it said softly. "You stayed when the body left." Ethan fell to his knees, gripping his head. "No, no, I'm real. I'm real," he shouted. But as he looked around, the apartment began to fade, the walls turning transparent, the air becoming thin like smoke. He reached for the table, but his hand passed through it. The truth hit him like a knife. He had died that night in the apartment. The sound of the glass shattering, the cold that filled his lungs, it wasn't a dream. He had never escaped. The world outside, the ash, the silence, it was his mind trying to understand death. The shadow stepped closer and knelt beside him. Its voice was calm, almost kind. "You can stop running now." Ethan looked up, tears mixing with the dim light. "What happens now?" The shadow extended its hand, black and endless. "You fade," it whispered. Ethan reached out. The moment his hand touched the darkness, everything went still. The room was empty again. No sound, no movement. Only sunlight and silence. But if someone walked into that apartment later that day, they would notice one strange thing. On the far wall, where the light always hit in the morning, there would still be a faint outline of a man. A shadow that never moved. The story of Ethan and his shadow had ended, but the apartment had found its next observer.